My name is Bill Yoshino. I was a member of the JACL National Staff for many years, serving as the Midwest Director, which is located in Chicago.
And could you maybe give a brief description of what the Midwest Director role, what that job entailed?
Yeah, part of well, I should say the role of the Midwest Director really was, very succinctly, it was to implement the policies of the national JACL throughout the chapters in the Midwest. So for example, if there were various policy issues that the national organization had decided were important, and if they had like a legislative impact, one of the things that we would do would be to urge our various chapters to contact, for example, local elected public officials, if this meant, for example, trying to get legislation passed in Congress, to get them to contact through both letter writing and phone calls those elected officials to try to persuade them to join in with whatever that particular issue might have been. A lot of the other things too, just apart from things like legislation, I know a lot of the time I spent had to do with anti-Asian sentiment, discrimination, hate crimes, those sorts of things. And throughout my tenure in the JACL office or in the JACL Midwest office, I know we were engaged in that sort of activity, either through monitoring the media for instances of defamation, for example, or in some cases, if there were hate crimes that were committed in various areas of the Midwest or even nationally, what we would then do would be to locate and get assistance from local chapters in trying to find ways to pursue whatever that hate crime was. In the case of things like defamation, we would seek out the source of whatever that defamation was and encourage whoever the entity was, the person, the company, whatever it was, to refrain from using that type of defamatory language.
Thank you. And if you were, I think the bulk of our conversation will focus on redress and the process, particularly in JACL, of achieving redress. If you were to explain broadly what Japanese American redress was, to a lay audience, what would be your maybe introductory explanation to what redress is?
Yeah, I think redress was an effort, a fairly extensive effort by the Japanese American community to seek remedies for the injustices that occurred during World War II, having to do with the incarceration of virtually the entire West Coast population of Japanese Americans. It constituted an issue that had great impact, not only from a personal point of view in terms of the various experiences that the Japanese Americans as individuals had in being forced from their homes and going to the camps, to the constitutional impact of the incarceration, because you're dealing with American citizens here who were denied their rights as citizens, and also too permanent residents who have rights as well, having those rights denied. So I think in the broad sweep, it had to do with really portraying at that time, and I'm thinking back to the period of the 1970s and 1980s, a story which was little known by the American public, and it was a story that we felt had great consequence simply because it was an issue that could repeat itself, not for Japanese Americans necessarily, but for other vulnerable minority groups.
And when did you join JACL as a staff person?
I was hired in 1978, in the latter part of 1978. Interestingly, it was just following the convention, which had been held in Salt Lake City in 1978, in which they came up with an actual proposal to pursue remedies or to pursue redress. And among those remedies was to seek compensation and an apology for the government. So in some respects, I came on board at a time when we were just beginning that entire effort in a very formal way.
So coming into your job with this mandate or maybe roadmap coming out of the convention, what were some of the sort of early actions that you were tasked with in putting that vision into practice?
Well, I was hired fairly soon after I came on board to be part of the redress staff effort that emanated out of our headquarters in San Francisco. And so at that time, there was a lot of discussion as to what the organization ought to be doing. There were elements within the organization and outside of the organization who wanted to pursue direct compensation immediately. And then JACL finally got tracked on this course of pursuing the establishment of a federal commission. The reason for that being that the commission would serve as a vehicle to promote education about what had happened to Japanese Americans during World War II. And I think you have to look back at that period of time. It was an issue that was very little known among the American public. It was a subject that wasn't taught, for example, in the schools. It wasn't something that, especially off of the West Coast, that people would be very familiar with. So there was the thought that there would be a need for a commission simply to educate the public, and by way of doing that, educate the members of Congress to what the issue of the Japanese American incarceration was all about. So that was, and so the thrust, I think, of that early part of it was to just really try as much as possible to find ways to gain access to vehicles, be it the media, schools, or other outlets, to try to get our story in there so that people would become educated about it. And of course, that was, as I mentioned, that was the initial pursuit of the organization to actually establish that commission, which had to be done through legislation in Congress.
Thank you. Maybe backtracking a little bit, do you have any insight into how JACL developed their positions around redress? How did JACL decide to go forward with an effort to achieve individual compensation, along with some of the other pieces around educational programming? But do you know how did that platform come together?
Yeah, I wasn't present for the discussions that took place at that Salt Lake City convention, but I do know that there had been ongoing discussions since about 1970. In fact, that in 1970, the JACL convention was held here in Chicago. And that's the time in which individuals, or a particular individual, Edison Uno, first posed the idea of pursuing some type of remedy related to the incarceration. And without really knowing what the actual discussion was in Salt Lake City, I would imagine that the delegates there were saddled with the idea of how it was that how we would pursue all of this. And I believe that there were some proposals that were put to them, but it was always, I think, framed in this idea that because it was an issue that had personal consequence for the individuals involved, that the remedy had to be one which addressed the impact on individuals. And of course, in order to do that, you had to look to what the remedies were. And in the American system of justice, very oftentimes, damages consist of compensation. And so I think that was the fundamental framework for pursuing it that way. Then, of course, too, because of the responsibility and culpability of the federal government, that there had to be entailed an apology to demonstrate, that culpability.
Thanks. One of the things you've been talking about so far is the need to share the Japanese American experience with a broader audience. And one of the ways that I see this happening, or I see this having happened, was in the CWIRC hearings that took place almost 40 years ago now. How did those hearings come about? How were the cities selected? And then how did Chicago play into that?
Yeah, I think that when, the idea for the hearings, of course, was to identify people who could testify as direct witnesses to the event being the incarceration. And I know that the initial direction would be to go to communities where there were large populations of Japanese Americans and where all of this originated too. So you would go to the West Coast. So I think that the initial sites that were determined were places like Los Angeles, for example, places like Seattle, San Francisco, major population centers of Japanese Americans on the West Coast. I know that during that particular discussion, we had our national staff that was in contact with the commission, and one of the things that we here in Chicago wanted to do was to ensure that our story was going to be part of that, and our story being focused on the resettlement of Japanese Americans during and following World War II, because Chicago was the major site for people who were resettling out of the camps during the war years, and then obviously following the war years too. There were a number of people who had decided to come to Chicago as well. So part of what we wanted to do was to make that argument that Chicago was a place that would be critical in terms of a hearing. I think the other part of that as well is Chicago is kind of a central, center within the Midwest, and that the witnesses we would draw upon wouldn't simply be located here in Chicago, but they could come from the adjoining states like Michigan and Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Missouri, and that's basically how it turned out. In fact, people did serve as witnesses by coming to Chicago, traveling from those states.
Could you talk a little bit more about why you thought it was important to include the resettlement experience in this overall hearing landscape?
Yeah, I think that part of the reason why people had left the camps to come to places like Chicago, and not just Chicago, but the East Coast, places like Minneapolis and Dayton, Ohio, and Cincinnati, places like that was there were a number of people, and my parents were among them, that simply wanted to find a way to get out of camp as quickly as they could. And so they had to go through a leave clearance procedure in order to do that and show that they had a sponsor of some sort or a job out of camp. And so places like Chicago, for example, because it was an industrial city, that there was like a lot of war production going on, so there were many jobs available, it gave folks or people, internees, an opportunity to begin pursuing their life in a new situation. And this is, again, prior to their being released from the camps at the end of the war. The other thing, too, is I think that's kind of interesting is that when people left the camps, it wasn't as though that they were just told to go out there and make a life for yourself. I mean, essentially, that's what they had to do. But they were also instructed by the War Relocation Authority at that time not to congregate in groups, for example, not to for fear of creating suspicion or fear among the residents of whatever community they were resettling in. And it's kind of interesting that I think is, as much as the government wanted to steer away from the notion of reestablishing, so-called Japanese ghettos in Chicago, as there were in places like Los Angeles and San Francisco and Seattle, that they failed. Sorry about that, Lisa. Phone call came through.
That's okay. You were talking about this tension around creating ethnic enclaves in Chicago, and we'll also edit this out.
Right. Yeah. So the intent of the government then was to establish Japanese Americans in various communities, but to do it in a way in which they weren't establishing these various enclaves as it happened on the in the West Coast. And although I think people, meaning Japanese Americans, at first may have tried to comply with that, I think in the end that wasn't successful, because in fact, when the community here in Chicago at least was formed, the community, through its leadership and through the efforts of individual Japanese Americans, really did form their own institutions. And although you didn't have enclaves with a great deal of density, you did have areas where you had commerce that was Japanese Americans in different parts of the city of Chicago. Interesting to note, I think, along with that, is that at that time, places like Chicago were deeply segregated cities. And so that Japanese Americans were really restricted to certain areas of the city, simply because of the covenants that might have been in existence, or I should say that were in existence at the time. So and these weren't always the best parts of town. They were sometimes the more marginalized types of areas. At the same time, too, I think while there were a lot of job opportunities for people who were coming to Chicago, the housing situation wasn't so great, because it wasn't just Japanese Americans who were coming to Chicago to find jobs. It were, there were people from all over the country. You had the migration, which was well into effect at that time from the South, among African Americans coming up from the southern states, moving to industrial cities like Chicago and Detroit, looking for jobs as well. So while there were plenty of jobs, there was great competition in terms of housing, and very oftentimes the housing situation that was open were in areas of the city which weren't always the most desirable in terms of the economics of the of the city or the individual.
Thank you. I think one of the maybe popular memories or myths about Redress is that it it opened up Nisei in particular to sharing their experiences of incarceration in a way that hadn't happened up until that time. How do you think, how easy was it to recruit Nisei to participate in these hearings, and in watching them happen, sort of what were things that you learned or took away from either the formal hearing process or this broader campaign to share the Japanese American experience alongside the redress movement?
Yeah, the witnesses are, Japanese Americans who were willing to share their story really became the, kind of the focal point of what I was doing, as well as others here in Chicago, just in terms of identifying individuals who were willing to share their experience. And I think to a degree, I would agree that there may have been a reluctance on the part of some at that time. And I think part of that was simply because they were very, very hesitant to come out because of the trauma of what they had gone through. When if you believe that you've come out of a shameful situation, and I think a lot of the Nisei especially, felt a great deal of shame. It was unwarranted, of course, but it felt a great deal of shame. One does not want to recount shameful episodes, especially in public. And so I think that part of it served as a deterrent. That, I think, too, was one of the reasons why many of the Nisei didn't share their experience, not just with people they knew, but with their offspring. And so I think that there was that sense of feeling that there would be that kind of a reluctance on the part of Nisei to step forward to serve as witnesses. To me, that was fairly quickly dispelled, though. And I think I think that once people understood what the impact of their stories might be on the whole process, that they felt a little bit more comfortable about coming forward. But I think too that sometimes talking about your experience serves as a catharsis as well. And I think that once many of the Nisei started hearing of people talking about their stories to themselves, because I think a lot of the Nisei, would share their stories with each other. Where were you in camp was one of the touchstones. That's how you kind of related to people you were just introduced to. They just, instead of saying, where did you come from or where are you from, very oftentimes they would simply say, what camp were you in? And that became a point of commonality in that experience. So through the years, they have been sharing that with each other. It's just that they weren't sharing it publicly. But I think once that many folks started hearing the whole idea of the Japanese American experience being discussed on news shows or in articles in their local newspapers, very oftentimes it kind of became something that they felt it was okay to be part of. And actually, one of the things that as we were trying to identify people to step forward, I remember that one of the things that we did was we used to send out notices to the community through various organization mailing lists, that sort of thing, both encouraging people to testify and at the same time telling them the impact that their stories might have. But at the same time too, we told them that we would provide assistance to them both in structuring their written testimonies and their oral testimonies as well. So what we would do is we would provide workshops and that sort of thing to, give them some guidance, not to tell them what to say, but simply to give them some guidance and helping them write their written versions of the testimony. And because we knew that they were going to be limited in terms of the amount of time that they would have to try to get them also to focus. But it was my experience that many of the Nisei actually wanted to share their experiences. It's something that they wanted to talk about, and I think in the end, it served kind of as a catharsis to many of them, to simply be able to share, or in some cases to vent, whatever the experience had been for them, depending upon the level of trauma. And I just remember going back to, and thinking about some of the testimonies I heard, and many were very traumatic, and many of them, obviously did have an impact. And I think that in the end, a lot of those testimonies did do a lot to frame what the public record ended up being about the incarceration experience.
Thanks. I'll put in a quick plug here, but the Chicago hearing is fully digitized online by Northeastern Illinois University. So folks can find, the full footage of those hearings online now. And I'll ask that when this video is shared, that the link to those videos is included with it. So people who are watching this can also go and watch the recorded testimonies from the Chicago hearings. But I thought it was really interesting, you talked about having workshops for people to help figure out not what to say, but how to say it. So what were some of the things you were encouraging people to do, or ways you were encouraging people to frame their stories for this hearing?
Yeah, we, one of the things was that there were several hearings that took place before the Chicago hearing. I think the West Coast, LA, San Francisco, Seattle, and I think there was also a hearing in Alaska, the Pribilof Islands, one of the two, that preceded Chicago. So we kind of had a sense of what was happening. We also knew that a lot of the testimonies that were given, or I should say some that were given in those cities, some of the testimonies tended to ramble on to the point where there wasn't enough time left for the commissioners, for example, to ask questions. I think that people were given something like 3 minutes or 5, I forget, it was 3 or 5 minutes in a time frame. So what we decided to do was to, let people know that they really had to focus on something. They weren't going to be able, unfortunately, to tell their whole stories, but they were going to be able to focus on an aspect of their experience to share in a very brief period of time. So that's kind of one of the things that we wanted to do, was to at least have people take a look at the content that they were going to cover within their stories. The other thing that we did was to have sessions within those workshops where they could actually practice giving their testimony. This is after they've written their testimony, of course, and we gave them guidance that way. In some cases, I mean, we would just, we would literally, write the testimony, have the person having expressed what it is that he or she would want to say. But what we would do is we would kind of have practice sessions. I know that on the West Coast, I think I forget where, in some of the cities, they used to have some mock hearings, that kind of thing. We felt we didn't want to necessarily go in that direction. We just simply wanted to give them an opportunity to sit there and then give their testimonies. What we didn't want to do was to try to take away spontaneity, that sort of thing, from whatever they were going to say, and make it look as though what they were saying was very practiced that sort of thing. So what we would do is we would give them or allow them the opportunity to give their testimonies and then to comment on it if they wanted to. But I think it just gave them some assurance, or gave the witnesses some assurances, and hopefully some level of confidence too, in terms of what it was that they were going to say and how it was they were going to say it.
Thanks. So moving, I guess moving chronologically, after the hearings and then the commission issued its report, can you talk about sort of what your professional next steps were, after the report was released, sort of what happened next?
Yeah, I mean, that part of it, that time frame was pretty critical, because when the commission released its report, and really the charge of the commission, if we remember this correctly, is that they were to kind of look into the facts surrounding what had happened, and then to make recommendations to be considered by Congress. And so, of course, they came up with a set of findings which found the government action unjustified, basically, and went through the various reasons for that. But then they also had a set of recommendations. Among them was individual compensation, and the commission came up with a figure of $20,000, and an apology, and then the setting up of an educational trust fund. It also, I think, had a few other recommendations beyond that. But I think that what that did was it basically set the course for the next step for the Japanese American Citizens League, and for the community, in terms of the type of legislation that would be introduced into Congress to pursue a redress bill that would finally be enacted and then signed by the president, which happened, approximately 8 or 9 years later.
Could you talk at all about the process of developing the bill and how it got passed?
Yeah, that I know that the bill writing was left to it came through Congressman Norm Minetta's office, and I believe the person who was involved in writing the actual legislation was an individual named Glenn Roberts from his office. And of course, a lot of what he, in all likelihood, did was to rely upon the contents of the commission report, Personal Justice Denied, the facts that were in that, and then to take the recommendations and, through whatever discussions he had with Congressman Mineta, along with the other members of the Nikkei delegation in Congress, and then members of the Japanese American communities and others. That's, I would suspect, how they framed that legislation. For me, still serving as the Midwest director, once that bill was dropped, part of my charge was to try to get our various chapters here in the Midwest to begin an effort to lobby their members of Congress to support that legislation. The Midwest during that time, and still today, is a very important region of the country in terms of Congress, because you have a great diversity of views represented in Congress, both on the Republican and the Democratic side, as well as just the sheer numbers of representatives that you have in the Midwest states. So the Midwest, in many ways, was pretty important to the whole cause of redress. So a lot of what our efforts were involved in during that period of time were to work with various of the JACL chapters, whether they were in St. Louis or whether they were in Detroit or Minneapolis, and get them to reach out to their various members of Congress. And in many cases, there were, contacts had been made through the years with various members of Congress, and I think those personal relationships that had been developed between the JACL members or members of the Japanese American communities, along with their representatives, became pretty important. And I think that a lot of individual members of Congress were convinced by local Japanese American community members to support the cause.
Thank you. This is maybe a little off topic, but I really echo what you just said about I'm very proud of the Midwestern Japanese American community, and in particular want to underscore the political strength and significance of the Midwest within a broader Japanese American context. I think, in the history of redress and multiple approaches to redress, one of the things that strikes me about JACL is that it's sort of uniquely positioned as being an organization that has infrastructure in the Midwest in a way that other Japanese American organizations didn't and still don't. Do you know why that happened? I know chapters form because people resettled in lots of cities, but do you have any sort of insight into how the JACL was able to maintain strength in the Midwest over many decades?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I guess I have to kind of think back to the the initial establishment of JACL chapters in the Midwest, and I think most of the chapters were formed probably 1944, 45, 1946. And it coincided with the movement of Japanese Americans out of the camps to resettle in these various places. And I think what, and part I think of what happened was that JACL in its early years in these places became a social outlet for a lot of community members. Yes, we were a civil rights organization. Yes, we were dealing with various issues. But at the same time, too, JACL, I think, served other social-based needs within the community. I think JACL in Chicago might be an outlier in some ways because you did have other organizations, churches, that type of thing that had also been formed. So the JACL had to develop its niche among the various organizations here in Chicago. But if you go to the other various cities in the Midwest, like Milwaukee and Cleveland, St. Louis, the JACL very oftentimes was the only game in town with respect to the Japanese American community. So that in addition to its serving as an outlet to advocate for whatever the needs were in that local area, that it also provided for a lot of various social activities, social events, and that sort of thing. And so I think that that history, kind of made it the kind of go-to organization in a lot of the various communities in the Midwest, including in Chicago. And so I think that established JACL in that way as in most cases the primary organization within the Japanese American community. And so that when issues would come up, be it the redress issue that we're talking about now, or even going back to other issues having to do with, for example, the the Walter McCarran Act. That was a piece of legislation that had to be run through Congress as well, and it was run through what was called the Discrimination Committee of National JACL, while you had a lot of local discrimination committees put together chapter by chapter, and the Midwest was pretty active in that, in that legislative effort too. So I think that the experience of JACL in terms of its legislative history and in terms of the redress movement gave some credibility to the organization in terms of its ability to affect and to shape issues that benefited the community.
Thanks for entertaining my tangential question. I would be interested, sort of as you think back on the decades-long process of achieving redress, what were moments where you felt like the bill, you felt really confident about the ability for the bill to pass, and maybe what were moments where you were worried or apprehensive about the process?
Yeah, I think that I remember the successes. I think they're the easy things to remember. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be present for the signing of both the commission bill and the Civil Liberties Act as well. So I mean, those were pretty memorable. I think too that the length of time that it took from the time that the commission released its report until the time that the bill was actually signed in 1988 by President Reagan was, there were a lot of, kind of ups and downs, and it was just a long period of time where you just kind of wondered whether or not this thing was going to, to be successful or not. I know that during the time I was involved with, various aspects of the redress campaign, and I feel fortunate to have been involved, in some small way with that. I mean, to me, it was kind of, I just remember thinking to myself, this is got to be the most important thing that, that I'm involved in, and I felt very, very dedicated to wanting to do all I could at the time. And of course, a lot of my activity was either fairly local or fairly regional, even though I was part of the national redress staff on this, so that I would be involved in helping develop materials on the national level, maintaining, I remember, the legislative database here in Chicago that stored up a lot of the information about how the various members of Congress were reacting to redress or to the prospect of redress from around the country. But I just know that I just remember that every time there was a hearing that was scheduled for Congress, we would always become very excited about the prospect of that hearing. I think that for me, though, a lot of the efforts surrounding the hearings themselves, I think, were some of the most memorable and important, because it was a time where our community really got involved personally, in that part of the process. And of course, they meaning the witnesses who gave their testimonies are the ones who really helped shape the eventual destiny of what happened with that bill that finally was signed by Reagan. But it was just, I think, what I do is I tend to kind of think back to the memories, of those who were testifying, and even those who didn't testify, over the years, just hearing their stories, because it's interesting to know that, that there were a lot of people that didn't have the opportunity to testify either. but yet they have their stories and their experiences. And I know that over the years I was, in a position to be able to talk to many of them, where they felt very comfortable in sharing what had happened to them. And I just, I would just always think about, wow, this is really, fantastic. I would kind of say to myself, this person is sharing, this story where they might not have necessarily been totally comfortable in sharing it with a complete stranger before. So that was always very, very comforting for me, whenever I would come in contact, especially with Nisei, in some cases some Nisei, but primarily Nisei over the years. One of the other things too that I remember was that there were some Nisei in our community who testified, and I think from that they kind of caught on to this whole idea that social justice is important because it just doesn't affect them; it affects everybody. And I remember that after the 2001 attacks in New York and Washington, D.C., that there were Nisei who were stepping forward to talk about their story because they knew their story was really the story about what was happening to Muslim Americans. And so by sharing that, of course, they were really talking about trying to prevent the same type of fate that had occurred to them. So that was that part of it. I felt was also very, very, comforting to me to see that and to see that they had extended beyond their own personal experience to go to other communities to try to help.
Yeah, I think you're helping to pivot to what my next question would be, which is about the impact of redress. What do you see as some of the impacts, aside from the literal people received checks? What are some of the broader either psychological, political, community-based impacts that you see of redress?
Yeah, I think that there were I think that whole experience, it had its resonance in the community and, in many different ways. I think back to some of the testimonies actually that were given. There was this one individual, his name was Toru Ishiyama. He's a psychologist, and he, I believe, worked for the Department of Public Health for the state of Ohio. But Toru talked about the trauma, the psychological trauma of the incarceration on an individual. And he told his own personal story about how, afterwards he was very angered by it, and the way that he would channel his anger living in Cleveland was to vow he would never go to California because he saw them as, California as being the source of creating all of this anxiety and angst within him from a psychological standpoint. He eventually got over that, but he said that was the point, that there was all this kind of pent up psychological trauma. He talked about how, I remember from his testimony, he said that when a child feels abandoned, it cries, and he said that for the Nisei in 1942 they never cried, and that's why when Nisei started having these camp reunions in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. They used to go to these reunions, and all they would do is cry because they were crying because they weren't able to back in 1942. And he talked about the reason for that was because of their loss. and that's and that's the reason for that outpouring of emotion. So I think that part of the impact was that part of it was kind of resolved, I think, or not, maybe not resolved, but it was that's what the hearings, I think, and that's what the entire campaign and the entire time provided, I think, for a lot of people internally within the community. It kind of they were able to reconcile themselves with the past. And I think one of the lessons that came out of that was that it was kind of a searing memory, that was going to be part of each of those individuals forever. It wasn't something they could ever run away from. I think in the larger perspective, and I think that a lot of the Nisei, I don't know. I mean, I've heard different things about how they viewed compensation, and the $20,000 that they received. That I think there are some that would say that to a lot of people it wasn't, that wasn't the important thing. It was the whole idea of getting the government to finally admit wrongdoing, and yes, that was the important part of it. I remember some of the Nisei, talking about instead of keeping that compensation, they would donate it back to community organizations, and I think that's a great thing to do. But I didn't fault those, who said that they were going to go out and buy a Toyota, and there were some who, literally said that, they were free to do it with what they wanted to. But I think, though, that many of them, saw the larger lesson in what that redress bill provided. And that was that hopefully it would act as a deterrent for future similar actions on the part of the government. And I just have to say that I'm hopeful that that's what happened, as a result of 2001 and what was visited upon the Muslim American community in this country. The government didn't totally learn its lesson, because it did detain, many individuals in the wake or in the aftermath of those attacks. But I think that the advocacy that surrounded trying to protect that community was something that was, so good to see. And I think a lot of it was inspired because of what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II, when virtually no organizations or no voices were out there speaking on behalf of our community. So I think that that and even continuing issues to this day having to do with various immigration-related things and various detention types of situations that are occurring out there, harken back to our experience during World War II.
Thank you. One of the other things that I would generalize about redress, whether it was through JACL or activation in NCRR, NCJAR, or even in the Quorum Nobis cases, was I see it as this moment that really catalyzed Sansei engagement and brought Sansei together, maybe just together in their different organizations, but sort of politically mobilized, or was an outlet for political engagement amongst Sansei. Not to ask you to speak on it on behalf of an entire generation, but how, why or how do you think it got so many Sansei together to act in this way?
Yeah, so excuse me. Yeah, I think I think part of that political activism we can thank for the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which found its way to trying to establish things like Asian American Studies programs, at various West Coast universities at that time, and the degree to which those types of activities really needed activism, advocacy, and protest in a lot of cases. And I think that entire movement out of the 1960s really is what generated or what motivated a lot of the involvement and among the Sansei generation. I don't know, I at that time wasn't thinking so much generationally as being so much focused on the issue, but I can see how individual Sansei, having been the offspring of a people who were literally oppressed for what they were during that period of time, would have motivated them to action. And yes, I do think that the redress movement gave that opportunity for a lot of those individuals to become involved. I remember back during the days of the redress campaign that we had various redress representatives from each of our various chapters. And I think virtually all of them, in terms of the leadership, were Nisei. But behind all of that, I know that there was a great level of activity among the Sansei. For example, here in the Chicago chapter, you had Sansei who served really at the core of the Chicago Redress Committee, who were moving that particular issue and trying to spread the word about it here in the Chicago area. And I think that was the case. I think of, excuse me, I think of the case of Detroit, and I know that there were some very, very active Sansei up there who were involved in redress as well, and who eventually, incidentally, became involved in the Vincent Chin case up there, when that came about, I think in 1982. So I think that activity just spawned activism among many of the Sansei, not just in redress, but I think in many, many other, social justice issues during and after that period of time.
Thanks. Keeping in a sort of a generational question, one of the things I see in your professional legacy is this emphasis on storytelling and an emphasis on passing Japanese American history on from generation to generation. So, I know you're really instrumental in forming the Kansha Project, which is a program through JACL Chicago to educate young Japanese Americans about incarceration history. And then you recently started another program through JACL Chicago called Our Story, which brings a speakers bureau to local public schools, public libraries, community centers. Could you talk a little bit about, why that's important to you, why it's important to have these intentional ways to pass on this history to future generations?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. Thanks for, mentioning that activity, which I, always felt is important. I mean, in the Kansha program, to me, the thrust of that was to try to link really one generation to the next generation. I thought that was always very, very, very important. I'm not talking about just the Sansei generation to the Yonsei, linking the Sansei generation to the Yonsei generation, but really trying to find ways to link all of the generations in some way, because part of what I know that we used to try to do during some of the the trainings was to, or some of the sessions was to involve Nisei, so that that part of the story or that generation could be represented to the Yonsei generation and beyond, just beyond the Sansei generation. I mean, I think this whole idea of perpetuating our story is just so important in any way that it can be done. I know that during the time I was involved with JACL as part of the staff, one of the more important things that I felt that I was involved in were putting together workshops where we would take our story to teachers, and that what we would try to do is to develop various curriculum materials, attend conferences, social studies conferences, and then to actually get into communities through schools to present trainings for them so that they could then teach about our experience in their classrooms. Our story is really important. When I say our story, I mean the story of the Japanese American community, and I think that part of the reason for that is because there was a time when we weren't there at all in terms of our story being told. We were almost like we were missing, in the history of America. And I think that omission, and I know it was there because I didn't get that when I was in school, when I was in high school. There was nothing that was mentioned having to do with Asian Americans as being part of the American experience. And so I think that omission has always left a deep impression on me, because there is so much to be gained by knowing you're part of the experience, by having that experience told. There's so much role modeling, there's so much being able to affiliate yourself, in terms of the history. And if it isn't told, that's, I think, what causes a lot of folks to be alienated in terms of who they are, and not having a basis for, belonging really to this country. So that's why I felt it was always very, very important. Unfortunately, in many places still, it's not a story that is being told in a formal way, meaning that it's not being mandated, by various states within their curriculum or within their learning standards. So there's a lot of work yet to be done. But the fact that it is being told in certain places, I think gives at least great satisfaction and great comfort to me, because it just is kind of a, because it was something that I just wasn't able in my more formative years to have exposed to me.
Thank you. I just have one more question. Maybe keeping on bringing it to today. I think while you were still on staff at JACL National, JACL passed a resolution in support of HR 40, and I know David Inoue, the current executive director of JACL National, has been vocal in encouraging members in this time to support HR 40 and to think about reparations for slavery and for the Black community today. Just, do you have any thoughts about, the importance of Japanese Americans supporting this effort, or the significance of Japanese American reparations for other reparations movements in the United States?
Yeah, I know that it's something that's been pursued by the Black community for decades, really. I think, if I remember right, I think John Conyers, congressman out of Michigan, would introduce a commission bill having to do with Black reparations in virtually every session of Congress, and it never ever got anywhere. Yeah, so I think it's something that the organization, unfortunately, hasn't been as supportive of as it could be. It's a bill, I think, and even especially today, I think it's something that's very important, because it's, you know, having something like that's very affirming in terms of your own community's history and their standing, you know, within the within the country. And I think that you know, I mean, that's what the redress bill did for us. I think it was very affirming. I don't know what directions ultimately that the that the Black reparations movement will take, but I think it's something that needs to be heartily supported. In fact, I don't even, yeah, I don't, excuse me, I don't know what the contents are of that resolution 40 you're talking about, you know, what it resolves finally, what it should, you know, what it finally resolves to do. But I think the fact that the JACL has that, if it has passed, then, you know, that's an important first step, you know, and hopefully with what's going on today, that, you know, that is going to be integral to a lot of the effort that's being made in terms of efforts within the Black community, much beyond all of these ideas having to do with law enforcement.